Welcome back to Mawsum Metrics. I'm Prati Kamasani, and in this video we will look into logging framework for Mawsum Metrics. Logging is a crucial step when it comes to data pipelines. I really missed this during my Power BI days, but I used to do logging a lot when I was working with the SSIS and creating the data warehousing solutions. Logging helps us monitor the health of our solutions and our processes. And it is also very useful data to notify us like when things goes wrong. It is also very useful to tell us sometimes some processes are taking longer than it's supposed to. So it's a very good way to monitor the solutions. And where you create logging, how you create logging, or why you create logging, it changes from organization to organization. I personally prefer to create a separate logging for each project or each solution, so that when you're monitoring it, it's cohesive enough. It's not bombarded with every other project that's going on. But again, it changes how big your team is, how big your project is, how where you sit in an organization, it kind of changes. And again, I think it's one of those best practices that you kind of have to sit down with architectures and think thoroughly, where do we want to keep the logging, how we want to create logging, and what do we want to capture as part of the logging. With Microsoft Fabric or any platform, the platform itself provides some logging. You could go to Log Analytics or something like that to be able to see what's happening with your entire environment. But this logging framework that I'm talking about, it is very specific to your solution. Not we are not trying to replicate what's already been available within the platform. There's no point of duplicating the work. But what we are trying to do is to understand what's happening within the solutions. So if you take Mawsum Metrics as an example, we are going and we are getting the data for European countries, and we are bringing the data for each city. And we want to run this technically every day, which I'm probably not going to do it, but that is kind of like in real life scenario, that is probably what I would do. And I want to, once the entire solution is developed, I will productionize it, and then there you go. It goes on the schedule and it's just recurringly, it executes every day. And if I'm somebody who is taking over this solution, I want to understand what's happening, how this solution is running. For example, every day my API gets me 200 rows, and someday there are only 10 rows. And because it's successfully executed, I wouldn't know why there are only 10 rows unless some end user spots it and was oh, I don't have enough data. Or some numbers doesn't match or something like that. Or if you have data quality reports on top of your entire solution, that's a different story. But before somebody comes and complain it, we as a good solution, we should have enough data-driven notifications to tell us hey, on average, these are the number of rows that you should be getting from this API. But in the last run, you didn't. You got only 10 rows. Do you want to go and have a look? And it could be a valid use case, and that's why you got 10 rows. But in the architecture, we need to have that kind of mechanism to handle this. And that's where logging really be useful. And also sometimes you want to go back and see you saw some data that not supposed to be there or something, and that happened because somebody went and executed a notebook instead of using the regular schedule. Somebody went and executed the notebook, and you want to understand who was that person executed it, to understand why, and not more for the name and shaming game, but more it could be a valid use case, and to understand these kind of details within the solution. That's when logging is really useful. And again, as I said, it changes from the organization to organization, project to project. So you need to think about what kind of information you want to capture in your logging framework. And there are a million ways how one can do logging, and we are going to look at one way of doing it. And somebody may come back and say, oh, I wouldn't do it that way. I would probably go and do another way. I would be more than happy to hear how other people want to do it. But let's jump into a little sketch to understand how I am planning to do this logging. So when it comes to the logging, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have 3 code blocks. They're very uneven code blocks, but anyway. And imagine this is my main code block where I do all my main operations. This is basically where I will, if I take the Europe data, this is where I'm calling my API, and this is where I'm inserting my data into Lakehouse. And before that block, I'm going to have a begin and I'm going to have end. This is very similar to having the SQL world, where we have the begin statement and end statement when we're working with store procedures or something like that. It's a similar logic. And in begin, I'll I'll start my log, and here I'll end my log. And in this case, I will look for number of rows, who executed, when, which table has been executed, and or which notebook that we are doing, and how long it took, and things like that. And when I'm looking it from a framework perspective, what I do is, this is one block of code and this is another block of code that I would create it in a way so that I could just copy and paste it in any notebook that I wanted to. And this piece of code is not going to be different. It's going to be where most of our operations happening. But this piece and this piece should be in a way so that you could just copy and paste it. So we're going to start by Lakehouse name, giving a Lakehouse name and Lakehouse description. I'm also going to add various libraries that I would need as part of this notebook. We'll go back to these libraries later. I think the important one is Semantic Link Lab. The rest of them are already there. I haven't included them in the environment yet, but I will include once I'm happy with my entire framework. I don't need the Spark session. I added it when I was working with Visual Studio Code, but here it's because I'm in the SaaS platform, I don't have to do that. So these are my variables where I'm giving the Lakehouse name and Lakehouse descriptions. I want to dynamically create this Lakehouse in the workspace that I'm working in. So for that, I need to get an understanding. What is the workspace I'm working with? And what is the workspace ID and workspace name? So this code block helps me to get that workspace ID and also the workspace name that I'm working with. By using those two, that information, what I want to do is this notebook should go and check in the workspace if there is a existing lakehouse called LH monitoring. If there is an existing lakehouse, go and use that. If not, create a new one. And that can be done with this piece of code. So what it's basically doing is it's using SemPy Labs, and then it's checking if the lakehouse is already there. If not, go and create it. So we are not attaching this lakehouse to this Explorer, but if we go back to our workspace and do a refresh, well, it was actually there. And you could see that LH monitoring is created. Now there won't be any tables or any files or anything in it. And when you hover over it, you could nicely see there is a description as well. Going back to the notebook, next I want to be able to write to this lakehouse without attaching into my Explorer. One way to do that one is by mounting that lakehouse to your notebook. And this is a piece of code that helps you to do that. Is we are mounting the lakehouse and then we are getting the lakehouse ID for the logging purposes, so that we need lakehouse ID so that we could write delta tables to this lakehouse. So first I have mounting and then I managed to get my lakehouse ID. I'm going to hide this output and the rest of the things is fine. At the moment, we have the lakehouse that we need. and we also have the Lakehouse ID where we want to save the data. The next thing that we need to understand what we want to capture as part of this logging framework. So we will begin by creating an empty log table, and this is the schema that I want to use for my log table. I'm going for notebook and also the table that I'm populating, rows before, rows after, rows inserted, who is the user executing it, and what kind of operation that we're doing. This is like, are you overwriting or are you doing the incremental loading, like, is it insert or things like that. How long the notebook ran. Yes, you do get this information by going into the, execution details of the notebooks and things like that, but I think this is like, gives a quick glance about like, how long it happened, how long it took. It is more like how long the API call kind of took, and if there are any messages that you wanted to keep as part of this execution, and also there is error message and there is timestamp. Next, I'm going to create an empty data frame with this schema. So that's pretty much what happens in that code. And now what I have is an empty data frame. And because I know Lakehouse where I wanted to write, if I open a new code block, this is the path where I want to create this Delta table. What is going on here? It's basically ABFSS path. I have the current workspace ID that is coming from over here, where I'm given the current workspace ID where I'm working with, and then I have the rest of the things is the just usual ABFSS path, and then I have my logging Lakehouse ID, and my logging Lakehouse ID is coming from over here. Once I mount my Lakehouse, I'm bringing back the logging Lakehouse ID back. So if I open the output, and this is where my logging Lakehouse ID is. I have the monitoring path where I wanted to save. Then I could, because I have the monitoring path, I could just say, okay, save my data frame to this monitoring path. And this is the empty data frame that we just created. So if I execute this, it's basically creating a blank table. If I go back to my Lakehouse, let me just quickly refresh it and click on the Lakehouse. And that's where my monitoring log is, and it has all the tables, all the columns that I mentioned in my schema. So I could include a little print message at the end saying like, okay, created. I'm going to merge this with the previous cell. So this is a cell basically where I'm creating my monitoring log table. And I could quickly do a quick check saying like, okay, just insert something into this table so that I have the data into this one. So for this, I am actually using a function called log changes, and we haven't defined that log changes function in here. These are the functions that we will be using in all our notebooks as well. So that's kind of where the framework comes. So I'm gonna just hide this output. Just above here, I'm going to create another code block and paste my functions that I'm going to work with. So the log changes, it's a function which basically taking pretty much all the column names values as the parameters, and it's taking this schema structure like we mentioned previously. It's a very simple thing. It's like, we are creating a list and then we are creating a data frame. So this is where the list is getting created, and then we are creating a data frame, and then we are also adding just updating the timestamp column with the current timestamp, and then I'm saving that into Lakehouse. And again, I'm calling another function here. So if we look into that function, again, it's a very simple function. It's basically, we are including a bit of error handling it. Try to write it to this destination with the append statement. And if there are any errors, add that into error message. So if I go back to this code block and execute this again, oops, I haven't actually defined my functions. So now I created my functions, and if I go back and execute this one, it should enter this one row, a sample row, into my log table. If I go back here and refresh, and you could see I have a sample row that's been developed, and that's pretty much it is like this is kind of what we are going to do with the logging framework. And I want to use this to in any of my notebooks. I would just take some of those functions that I'm using, like for example log changes, and put that block of code into my existing notebooks. Then it captures the information that I need. That's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to see how we are going to incorporate this logging framework into one of our existing notebooks, and also see how we could create those extra functions that we needed to capture those, like, the number of rows or the functions for how long the notebook took and things like that.